I want to be clear about something before I start. I am not a hero. I never was. I was a night watchman. I wore a uniform 2 sizes too large. I slept in a chair that had been broken since before I took the job, and the most dangerous thing I had ever faced before that winter was a rat the size of a small dog that had gotten into the Egyptian corridor and chewed the bandaging off one of Professor Sebastian's prize mummies. I chased it out with a broom. That was the high point of my professional career. I am telling you this because I want you to understand the gap, the very large gap, between what that night required and what I was able to offer it. And I want you to understand that the gap didn't matter. That's the part nobody tells you. They talk about courage like it's a substance you either have or don't have, like blood type or shoe size. What I know now, sitting here with my coffee going cold and my hands still not entirely steady, is that courage is mostly just what happens when a man is too exhausted and too annoyed and too personally invested in the safety of one specific woman to do the sensible thing, which is run. But I am getting ahead of myself. My name is Casimiro. I worked the night shift at the Museum of Wax and Curiosities for 3 years before the winter. Everything went sideways. The museum occupied a 4-story building on the edge of the old quarter of the city, the kind of building that had been grand once, with high ceilings and carved stonework above the doors and windows that let in drafts, no matter how many times maintenance was called. The floors were black and white marble, worn to a gentler pattern by decades of foot traffic. In the public rooms were dark wood panels that creaked at night when the temperature dropped, and they always dropped, because the building's heating system had been designed by someone who believed warmth was a luxury to be rationed. The ground floor was the public exhibition space. 12 rooms arranged in a horseshoe, each themed. Egyptian antiquities, medieval torture, scenes of famous crimes. A room dedicated to what the placard called the monsters of history and legend, which housed several figures in various states of frozen horror, all rendered in wax and lit from below so that their faces looked slightly worse than they actually were. There was a Viking. There was something meant to represent a werewolf, caught mid-transformation, one arm half human, and one arm decidedly not. There was a vampire, very theatrical, draped over a fainting woman who had been painted with slightly too much white on her face, giving her the look of someone who had received very bad news. I had walked past these figures hundreds of times. After the first week, they stopped troubling me, the way strange things stop troubling you when familiarity builds a callus over the instinct for alarm. I knew where the joints in the werewolf's arm caught the light wrong. I knew the slightly awkward angle of the vampire's knee. They were furniture to me, objects. The wax museum at 2 in the morning was as familiar to me as my own apartment, and considerably quieter. The floors above were administrative and storage. The basement was the professor's laboratory. I say the professor's laboratory as if I knew about it at the time. I did not. I knew there was a basement. I knew the professor, Dr. Sebastian, who held some advanced degree in a field I never managed to remember the name of, though he had explained it to me at least twice in the first month of my employment. Spent long hours down there. I assumed he was doing the kind of academic work that academics do, writing papers, cataloging things, arguing with correspondents. The door to the basement stairs was always locked when I tried it on my rounds, and after the 3rd or 4th time I found it locked, I stopped trying, because the museum paid me to watch for intruders and fire, not to investigate the private working habits of my employer. This was, in retrospect, a mistake. The professor himself was a man of about 60, thin in the manner of someone who regularly forgot meals, because something more interesting was occupying his attention, with white hair that he kept trimmed precisely, and a way of looking at you that made it feel as if he were calculating something about you at all times. The way an engineer looks at a bridge. Not unfriendly, just always measuring. He dressed formally even late at night, which I took as an eccentricity of his generation and class. He spoke carefully and was never rude to me, though I had the persistent sense that he regarded me as a piece of the building rather than a person in it. One more fixed feature of the environment, along with the heating system and the creak of the wooden panels. His 2 assistants, Ramos and Figueras, were a different order of creature entirely. Was broad and quiet, A man who communicated primarily through the angles of his posture, and whose loyalty to the professor struck me as the loyalty of someone who has been told a version of a story that makes the story sound reasonable. Figueras was sharper, younger, with quick dark eyes, and the habit of appearing around corners just after you decided you were alone. Not menacingly, just with an unfortunate talent for timing. Between the two of them, they handled the physical work the professor required. Moving equipment, receiving deliveries, maintaining the laboratory machinery in whatever state the professor demanded it be maintained. They were, I thought, an unremarkable pair of institutional handymen working for an unremarkable, mildly eccentric academic employer. I was not a good judge of character at that stage of my life. I have improved. The first sign that something was wrong came gradually. I began sleeping more deeply on duty than I ever had before. This alone would not have alarmed me. The job was quiet. The chair was warm despite being broken, and I had never been a man who fought sleep with any real conviction. My relationship with sleep had always been easy and mutually beneficial. I was available, sleep was available, we came to arrangements. But this was different. This was the kind of sleep that dropped on me like a falling wall, sudden and total. And when I woke from it, I felt hollowed out, thirsty in a way that a glass of water did not resolve, as if the thirst were in the muscle rather than the throat. Slightly gray around the edges of my vision, a quality that I noticed particularly in the first minutes after waking, when the amber safety lighting of the museum seemed to have a faint shimmer that passed as my eyes adjusted. My arms had a soreness in them, deep in the muscle, like I'd been carrying something heavy in my dreams. Sometimes in the crook of my elbow, sometimes on the inside of my wrist, a tenderness I could not explain and attributed, with the optimism of a man who prefers not to investigate bad news, to sleeping in awkward positions. Told Paquita about it over Sunday coffee at her aunt's cafe. She is, a remarkable woman. She worked 2 jobs at the time. Mornings at her aunt's cafe, managing the counter and the accounts, both with the efficiency of someone who has never had the luxury of doing one thing at a time. And afternoons as receptionist for a psychiatrist named Dr. Salazar, whose office was a 20-minute walk from the museum. The psychiatrist's patients were largely wealthy and largely anxious, and Paquita managed their anxieties in the waiting room with the same calm competence she brought to everything, offering them tea and not letting them see the appointment book. She had 4 other men pursuing her, with varying degrees of dignity and persistence. I knew about 3 of them, and the 4th I learned about only after the fact, and she had chosen me, which I have always regarded as either a testament to her extraordinary character or evidence of some early life trauma she never fully explained. She listened to my description of the fatigue and the soreness and the gray feeling at the edges of things with the attentiveness she gave to everything that mattered to her, not filling the silence with assurances as while I was still talking, just listening. Then she told me I should see a doctor. I see a doctor every day, I said. For one. He studies old bones and wax figures, she said. I see a real doctor. I did not go see a real doctor. This was also a mistake. What I did instead was accept the professor's explanation, which he offered one evening, when I apparently looked pale enough that even he felt obligated to comment. He said I had the look of a man with an iron deficiency. He recommended I eat more red meat. He said this while standing in the doorway to the basement stairs, wiping his hands on a cloth that I noticed was faintly stained. Not paint, not oil, but something darker and thinner, and his 2 assistants hovered behind him in the dimness of the stairwell in the way they always hovered, slightly too present and slightly too attentive. I thanked him and said I would look into the red meat. He nodded, and something in the quality of his attention shifted. The calculation I always felt in his gaze completed itself, arrived its figure, and moved on. He locked the basement door behind him. I slept in the chair for another 4 hours and woke up feeling like something had been scooped out of me with a large and not particularly careful spoon. The weeks accumulated. The fatigue was consistent now, not occasional. I began to organize my rounds differently, clustering them earlier in the shift, so that I had a longer uninterrupted stretch in the chair before morning. I told myself this was efficiency. I was not efficient. I was conserving what energy I had because there was less of it each week. and some part of me knew it without being willing to know it clearly. The museum itself continued its ordinary life around me. Of students came on Wednesdays, herded by teachers who had the look of people experiencing an obligation. Weekend visitors moved through the horseshoe of rooms with the focused attention people give to horror when it's safely framed and labeled. Children were frightened by the monster's room, and then immediately wanted to go back in. Old men read the historical plaques with satisfaction, as if the past's documented cruelties were personally vindicating life as it usually is. The mummy arrived in November. This was not unusual in itself. The museum regularly acquired pieces for its Egyptian corridor from dealers and brokers that the professor had cultivated over years. What was unusual was the manner of acquisition. Normally there was paperwork, a provenance certificate, a shipping manifest, a correspondence trail I could track because it came through the museum's front office, and Doña Catalina, the day shift receptionist, filed it in a particular cabinet, whose contents I sometimes examined during my early morning quiet period, when there was nothing else to do. This one arrived on a truck at 2 in the morning, with no paperwork at all, with no prior notification, with no dayside acknowledgement that it was coming. Ramos and Figueras carried the sarcophagus in themselves, grunting and cursing in whispers, while the professor supervised with a flashlight and a barely contained excitement I had never seen in him before. Not the measured satisfaction of a scholar who has acquired something he wanted. Something rawer than that. Something with a quality of finally about it. I was supposed to be asleep in my chair. I was not. I had woken from one of my hollow sleeps with a thirst that drove me to the water fountain in the Egyptian corridor. And I was standing there in the dark, drinking, when I heard the back door open and the grunting begin. I peered around the corner of the corridor and watched them bring it in. It was a standard Egyptian sarcophagus in its general shape, the kind with the stylized face on the lid and the painted bands of decoration running down the sides. The decorations on this one were unusual. I could see even from a distance that something was different about the iconography. The symbols not quite matching anything I'd seen in the corridor's genuine pieces. The lines were cruder in some places and more precise in others, as if several different hands had contributed to the work across a period of time. Painted face on the lid was wrong, in a way I couldn't immediately name. Most sarcophagus faces have a certain serene blankness, the Egyptian convention of the idealized departed. This one had a tension in it, something around the mouth and the brow that suggested the sculptor had been trying to show something other than peace, had been trying, and had partially succeeded. And the result was something that was not peaceful and not anguished, but somewhere between them, aware perhaps, waiting. I went back to my chair and pretended to be asleep. The sounds of them moving equipment continued for another 40 minutes. Then quiet. Eventually I was asleep genuinely, the hollow sleep, and I woke at 6, with the gray at the edges, and went home. In the morning there was nothing to see. The basement door was locked. Ramos and Figueras arrived at their usual time, and said nothing, performed their usual routines with slightly more concentrated attention to appearing normal than usual. Professor was not in his office. I asked the day shift receptionist where he was, and she said he was working and was not to be disturbed. In the tone she reserved for questions she considered beneath the dignity of her function. I went home, ate, and did not sleep well despite being horizontal. The weeks that followed were strange in a low-grade, persistent way. The professor's hours became even more irregular. Lights in the basement at 3, 4 in the morning. I noticed them because the gap under the basement door was visible from the main corridor at certain angles, an amber thread against the dark floor that was sometimes there and sometimes not. Sounds I couldn't entirely identify filtered up through the floor. Machinery, mostly the thrum and cycle of something electrical that rose and fell in patterns that might have been deliberate. And once what I would have sworn was a voice saying something in a register too low to make out, a sustained vibration more than words, the kind of sound that presses on the back of the jaw rather than entering through the ears normally. Sure. Ramos and Figueras developed the haunted, sleepless look of men who are being asked to do things they had not agreed to when they signed on. Not unwilling, exactly. More like men who have passed the point of objection and are now simply executing. The way soldiers execute orders, I've stopped thinking about. Caught Figueroa standing in the Egyptian corridor one night, staring at nothing in particular. Not at any of the exhibits. Just at the air between them, and when I spoke to him, he startled so badly, he knocked a display placard off its stand and looked at me for a moment as if I were the frightening thing. "You're jumpy," I said. "You would be too," he said, and did not elaborate, and walked away down the corridor in the direction of the stairs. My own fatigue worsened steadily. I was sleeping 4-5 hours in the chair on a good night. Real sleep, not the light doze that the job theoretically demanded, and waking from it feeling worse each time. Gray at the edges of my vision had become more persistent, present now, even in the middle of the afternoon, when I was at home and rested. I had begun to bruise easily, which Paquita noticed during a Sunday visit, and which prompted another discussion about real doctors, that I deflected with a bad joke that she did not find as funny as I did. What I want to be clear about, looking back, the fatigue was not just making me tired, it was making me less sharp, less attentive to the small disconnections that would have assembled, in a sharper man, into a picture I could have acted on sooner. Professor had calculated this. I understand it now in retrospect. He needed a watchman who was present and ambulatory. Someone who would conduct rounds, notice obvious intrusions, raise alarms about actual fires. But he needed that watchman incapable of asking the right questions at the right moments. He had achieved this with a needle and a tube and the deep sleep of a man who could always be managed into a chair. It was elegant in its way. I resent it somewhat even now. The night it happened was a Thursday in late November. I know it was a Thursday because Paquita worked late on Thursdays. The psychiatrist's office had an evening clinic for patients who couldn't come during normal hours, and we had arranged to meet at the cafe after my shift ended at 6 in the morning. The late November sky just turning from black to a deep cold blue by that hour. I was looking forward to it in the way a tired man looks forward to the one fixed point in a difficult week, the single thing that is reliably worth arriving at. I settled into my chair at 10:15 with a cup of coffee that I had no real hope of finishing while awake, and I went through my rounds at 11 and again at 1 in the morning and found nothing. At approximately 2 o'clock I fell asleep. I don't know what woke me. It wasn't a loud sound. It was more like a change in the air of the museum, a shift in the quality of the silence. I have spent enough nights in quiet buildings to know that silence has texture, that it has a specific weight and temperature, and that you develop, over time, an ear for when it changes. The silence had changed. Something had entered it. I sat up in my chair. The museum was dark, except for the low safety lighting along the corridor floors, orange strips that gave everything the color of old amber. I sat still for a moment and listened with the patience I'd developed over 3 years of night shifts, the particular stillness of a man who has learned not to move until he knows what he's hearing. Somewhere in the building, deep and irregular, came a sound like something dragging, not continuous, a step a pause, a step a longer pause, something relearning the mechanics of locomotion. My flashlight from the desk drawer. I did not take anything else, because the museum did not arm its night watchman, an oversight I was beginning to feel strongly about as I stood and moved toward the door. The flashlight was a substantial one, a metal-cased torch that had been in the drawer since before my tenure, heavy enough to be useful as an object even if its primary purpose was light. I held it low and went toward the sound. It was coming from the direction of the Egyptian corridor. I moved along the main hall, keeping my footsteps light and the flashlight beam close to the floor, and stopped at the entrance to the corridor. The figure was at the far end, 20 or 25 meters away. It was tall, taller than a man should be, or at least taller than the proportion of its limbs suggested it should be, with something in the distribution of its height that was not right, the torso longer or the legs shorter than anatomy normally allows. It was wrapped, but not in the neat museum manner of the display mummies in the glass cases. This was an older wrapping, desiccated and irregular, hanging in places and pulling tight in others, the color of something that has been underground for a very long time and has incorporated the underground into itself. The arms hung at angles that arms don't usually hang at when a person is simply standing. It moved. That step, pause, step again. each foot placed with tremendous care, weight transferred with the caution of a thing that is not entirely certain the floor will continue to support it. The head turned, and the flashlight found the face. The sarcophagus face, the one I'd seen on the lid from across the room when they'd brought it in. But wrong now in a way, the sculpted version hadn't been, because the sculpted version had been stone, and this was not stone, and the eyes were open, and they were pointed at me. I stood at the entrance to the corridor, and the creature stood at the far end, and between us were the glass cases and the amber light and approximately 20 meters of black and white marble floor. And I want to be precise about what I felt in that moment. I felt the specific, clarifying terror of a man who understands without any ambiguity that what he is looking at is not something that belongs in the world of the living. Not a man in a costume, not a trick of the low lighting, something that had been dead for a very long time, and was now, through whatever the professor had been building in his basement all these weeks, not dead anymore. It took a step toward me, slow, deliberate, absolutely certain it was going to arrive. I ran. I want to be clear that running was the correct decision and the only one available to me. I ran back through the main hall, around the corner, into the offices section, and I hammered on the door of the professor's office with the flat of my hand. No answer, dark under the door. And then I went to the basement door and tried it, and found it locked, and then I went to the front entrance and stood in the cold air of the street for a moment and made the decision that needed to be made. I went to the telephone in the lobby and dialed the police. The officer who answered was patient in the manner of a man who has fielded too many calls from frightened night watchmen in too many years of service, and has developed a professional sympathy for the position without any accompanying belief in the content. He asked me to describe what I had seen. I described it. He asked if I was certain I hadn't been asleep. I said I was certain. He said, with great courtesy, that he would note the call and have someone pass by in the morning to take a statement. I asked if someone could come sooner. He asked if the intruder was currently threatening me or still on the premises. I said I was outside and the intruder was inside. He said that was the safest arrangement and advised me to remain where I was until morning. I thanked him and went back into the museum. I do not fully understand why. I have thought about it many times. Part of it was the job. Not some noble sense of professional dedication, but the simpler and less glamorous fact that the museum was my assigned territory for another 3.5 hours, and I had no particular place to go, and no particular mechanism by which I could explain to myself that leaving was acceptable. Part of it was Paquita, which sounds strange because she was not in the museum. But the thought of something that wrong being loose in the same city where she was sleeping in her apartment 3 districts over was worse, somehow, than the thought of being in the same building with it. At least if I was in the building, I could account for it. And part of it was the dizzy calculus of a man who has been bled methodically for months and whose thinking is not operating at full specification, and who has lost somewhere in that fog the normal self-preservation instinct that would have kept him on the street. I went back in, I did my rounds. The Egyptian corridor was empty. The thing had moved. I found signs of it in the medieval room. A display case overturned, its glass face intact, but the case on its side, and the figure that had been inside it. A wax representation of some historical judicial proceeding, on the floor in a position that suggested something large had simply walked through it. In the monster's room, 2 of the standing figures had been displaced from their bases, and pushed aside as something moved between them. The werewolf knocked to one side, and the theatrical vampire lying at an angle that made his expression of horror seem, if anything, more appropriate than it had looked when he was upright. The window at the far end of the monster's room was broken outward. The latch had not been forced. It had been pushed through, the mechanism simply failing to accommodate the pressure applied to it. Cold air was moving through the gap, and outside, the street and the city beyond the street, dark and ordinary and unaware. Gone. I was standing there looking at the broken window when the basement door opened behind me and the professor appeared. He had clearly not been asleep. The coat, the careful hair, all of it, but disheveled now in a way it had never been during our normal interactions. as if the dishevelment had accumulated over a very long night of things not going as planned. Ramos and Figueras were behind him. Professor's expression was the face of a man processing a very large piece of bad news in real time, assembling the implications as fast as the information came in. "The specimen," he said. "Not a question, not directed at me specifically." "It walked out the window," I said. "I saw it in the Egyptian corridor first. It moved through several rooms and left through here." He looked at me, and for the first time in 3 years I felt the full weight of his attention as something with intention behind it. Not the idle calculation I'd always sensed, but a specific focused assessment of what I knew and what I represented as a problem. The warmth he'd always maintained, the courtesy, was still present the way a coat is still on a hanger, in the correct place but not being worn. "You will say nothing about what you saw," he said. His voice had the quality of a man who is accustomed to being obeyed. "I've already telephoned the police," I said. He stood very still for a moment. Then, "What did you tell them?" "What I saw. An intruder. A very unusual one." Another pause. "The kind in which a man is running calculations about damage limitation." "They won't believe you," he said. "I'm aware," I said. "They have a record of the call." He looked at me for a long moment more, and I looked back, and then he said something that has stayed with me since, because of how precisely it named what he believed about himself. "You don't understand what I've built here, Casimiro. What I was on the verge of. The implications for medicine alone. Something wrapped in bandages that used to be inside a sarcophagus, walked through several of your exhibits, and left through a window," I said. "Whatever its implications for medicine, it's currently in the city. That seems like the more immediate concern." He left with Ramos and Figueras. I sat in my broken chair until 6 in the morning, then went to meet Paquita at the cafe and sat across from her with my coffee and told her everything. She believed me without qualification. This is one of the many reasons I love her, that she does not perform skepticism as a social ritual. She accepted what I told her because she could see in my face that I was telling her the truth, and because she has always trusted her own ability to read a face more than she trusts the theory that impossible things can't happen. "You look terrible," she said. "Thank you," I said. "I mean it. Not just tired. There's something wrong with your color. You look like someone has been taking something from you slowly." "The professor suggested iron deficiency," I said. She looked at me with a patience that had sharpened into something else. "Casimiro, the man whose laboratory is doing things that produce what you just described. This man told you that you have an iron deficiency and recommended red meat, and you accepted this." "He's a doctor," I said. "He is something," she said. "Go see a different doctor, today, before you go home." I did not go that day, but I went that week, which was closer to the right decision than I had managed previously. The police came to the museum that afternoon, those same 2 officers, and looked at the broken window, and the toppled displays, and my account of events with identical expressions of professional noncommittal. One took notes. The other looked at the wax figures in the monster's room, with an unease he didn't entirely conceal, his eyes moving to the toppled werewolf and then away. They said they would file a report. They said these things happen sometimes with old buildings. They left. Nothing happened for 2 days. The city did its normal things. The museum opened at its normal hours and the day staff managed visitors, and Doña Catalina answered the telephone and the professor's door stayed closed. Ramos and Figueras were absent from the building entirely during this period, which was unusual enough that I noticed and noted it internally. On the 3rd day, a woman in the colonia, that doctor's neighborhood, reported that something had been in her building's courtyard in the night. The dog, she said, had gone silent, which was more alarming than if it had barked, because this dog barked at moths, and this particular night, it had gone completely quiet, crouched in the corner of the courtyard, and refused to move until morning. The garden wall had a section broken through it from the outside. The police noted this too. The day after that, a night security guard at a textile warehouse reported sounds from the roof and found tracks in the roof moss. Large, irregular, the weight distribution wrong, the stride length inconsistent. The day after that, a man was found early in the morning sitting on the curb near the municipal market, unable to account for the preceding 4 hours. with the specific dazed quality of someone whose body has been through something that his mind has elected not to retain. The city was beginning to accumulate evidence of something. Not enough evidence for any single person to name the thing, but enough for the pattern to be present if you were looking. I was looking. The professor was looking differently. He was pursuing. I watched him and his men loading equipment into a car in the museum's rear alley one evening. Canisters of some gas I couldn't identify, heavy restraints, and a device I had not seen before, a metal housing with a handle and a long probe ending in a coiled element that looked electrical. He worked with the focused efficiency of a man reclaiming stolen property, moving through the districts where the reports had clustered, always a day behind. I watched the moon. I had begun paying attention to the moon because the reports followed it. The incidents clustered in the days around the full moon, thicker and more violent, then thinned in the days after, then went quiet for the dark stretch, then began again as the light built back. Not every night, but the pattern was there, the lunar rhythm of something that had not entirely left its old nature behind even in its new condition. Thing that is dead, and then not dead, that was wrapped in the manner of the ancient dead, that becomes something else when the full moon finds it. Chief, I know how it sounds. I knew how it sounded at the time, alone in the amber light of the museum at 3 in the morning, assembling the pattern from the newspaper reports I'd been clipping and the things I'd seen. Myself, I was a tired man, building shapes out of shadows, but the shape held. On the third full moon after it had walked out of the museum window, it came back to the city with a different focus. Not wandering, directed, it came to Paquita's building. I was not there when it arrived. I was at the museum, sitting in my chair in the third hour of a shift that had been entirely uneventful, when the telephone on my desk rang. It was not the main museum line that was in the front office, and calls after hours were supposed to go to a service. This was the direct line, the one only a few people knew, and the voice on the other end belonged to Doña Esperanza, who lived in the apartment across the hall from Paquita's, and who was the practical, unflappable kind of woman who telephones for help when help is needed, rather than waiting to be certain about what she's seen. She had been woken by a sound from the stairwell. She had opened her door and looked and seen. She said, something large and wrong moving up the stairs, something that moved like a man who had forgotten that men have a particular way of moving. Something that she was not going to describe in more detail, because she preferred not to put it into words. She had closed and locked her door and was calling the police. She was calling me, because she knew Paquita knew me, and she felt someone else should know. I asked if Paquita was aware of the situation. She said the girl's lights were on, which meant she was home and probably awake. I hung up. I stood up from my chair. My back had stiffened in the familiar way from 3 hours of sitting, and it took a moment for my legs to communicate normally with the rest of me. I was lightheaded in the way I'd become accustomed to, that perpetual faint deficit that the weeks of blood loss had built into my baseline. Was wearing my watchman's uniform, which was too large, and I had my flashlight, which I stuck in my belt, and I went to the supply closet near the front door. The fire axe was on a hook on the right side of the closet. It was a real axe, red-handled, kept in the closet because the city required it and inspected annually. It had never been used for anything. I took it off the hook and held it and went out the museum's front door. I walked 6 blocks. The night was cold and very clear, the kind of cold that comes with a sky that has no cloud in it, and the full moon was directly overhead, bright enough to throw shadows on the empty street. My shadow walked beside me, slightly distorted by the angle, the axe silhouette extending from my hand like an extra arm. I passed a cat on a wall that watched me with complete indifference, which I found briefly comforting. I went into Paquita's building through the front door, which was unlocked as it usually was, and stood in the lobby and listened. The building had 4 floors. The staircase was to my left, a curving iron-railed affair that had been modernized at some point in the previous decade in a way that did not entirely match the original architecture. The iron rail, warm orange in the low hallway light. I could hear something above me. Not movement, stillness. Particular quality of something that has paused and is orienting. Then movement. That step pause step from somewhere above the first floor landing. I went up. On the first floor landing, nothing. The hallway quiet, the doors closed, light showing under two of them. I went up to the second floor. The creature was in the second floor hallway. It was facing away from me, facing the far end of the corridor. And I saw it in profile first, the height, the wrapped silhouette, the way the light from the hallway lamp hit the bandaging, in a way that made no concession to human proportion. Then it turned, the way a person turns when they become aware of something behind them, except slower, with more of the body involved, as if the decision to turn had to travel through more mechanism than a human body normally requires. It faced me. The moon was visible through the window, at the end of the corridor behind it, framing it against the light, and I watched in the space of several very slow seconds what the moonlight did when it found the creature fully. Posture changed. Something that had been conserved or contained in the way it held itself released. And what replaced it was animal and present and absolutely without the calculating deliberateness I had seen in the Egyptian corridor. The eyes were different. I am not going to describe them in detail. We'll say only that whatever condition the reanimation had produced, the full moon's contribution to it was not an improvement. It was between me and the stairs going up. I did not consider my options at length. There was not time, and I was not, as I have established, a man with extensive options to consider. Swung the axe sideways at the window frame to my left, putting the full weight of my arms and my shoulder into it. Crash was enormous in the quiet building. Glass and wood, and the ringing impact of metal on the frame, loud enough to be heard on every floor. Slats came on. Above me, the sound of a door opening. I swung again at the wall this time, putting a significant dent in the plaster, and making the kind of noise that ends all possibility of anyone nearby remaining asleep. Then I moved backward toward the staircase, fast, watching the creature. It was coming, not running. It was not capable of running, or chose not to, or had not yet remembered that running was a possibility. Walking, that deliberate, inexorable walking, each step placed with total commitment, nothing hesitant in it. It was coming, and it was between me and the floor enough above, and I had one choice about where to go, which was the direction of the staircase behind me. I went up backward for the first few steps, watching it, then turned and ran up properly. Past the second floor landing, past Paquita's door. I hit it once with the flat of my hand as I passed, and shouted her name and told her to go out the back, go up, move now. And up to the third floor landing, which was empty, its hallway as quiet as the second floor hallway had been before I arrived to disturb it. Below me, on the stairs, the creature. Above me, the fourth floor hallway, and at the end of the fourth floor hallway, the roof access. A hatch with an iron ladder bolted to the wall. I went up. The fourth floor hallway was empty, and the hatch was where I remembered it from a maintenance inspection during my first month of employment, when the professor had invited me up to meet the building supervisor. I went up the iron ladder with the axe in one hand and the other hand on the rungs, and pushed the hatch open with my shoulder and pulled myself out onto the roof. Cold, very cold and bright. The moon at full height, the city spread in all directions, the orange-yellow amber of the lit streets and the darker gaps of the unlit ones, and above everything the black of the sky and the white of the moon. I stood on the roof and breathed cold air and listened. Below the hatch, sounds on the ladder. I moved to the side of the hatch opening and waited. The axe was in both hands. My arms were shaking. From cold, from exertion, from the cumulative effect of months of blood loss on the stability of a man's hands under stress. I was aware of my heartbeat in a very specific way, counting it the way you count, seconds when you are waiting for something. The hands came through the hatch first, wrapped, wrong proportioned, feeling at the edges of the opening. I brought the flat of the axe blade down on them. The impact traveled up my arms and into my shoulders, and the sound of it was a flat, hard crack against the cold air. The hands withdrew. A pause. Then the creature pulled itself through the hatch anyway. It did this methodically, without the kind of urgency that pain would have produced in a living thing. Pulling itself through, because the hatch was the opening, and it had decided to be through the opening, and the decision was not subject to revision based on what had happened to its hands. It came through and stood up to its full height in the moonlight, and turned toward me. What followed on that roof I am going to tell you honestly. and without false drama, because false drama would make it sound better than it was, and worse than I was, and neither distortion serves the truth. I was not winning, that is the accurate statement. What I was doing was not winning. It was a sustained refusal to stop being present, which is a completely different thing. Creature was on the roof with me, and I was on the roof with it, and I had approximately 40 feet of flat surface for the edge, and a water tank housing in the center of the roof, and several ventilation pipes of varying heights and materials, and an axe that had never been used in anger before tonight. I kept the water tank between myself and it. I kept moving, not running, because running on an unfamiliar roof in the dark at the edge of a building would have ended the situation faster than the creature could have managed. Moving carefully, quickly, keeping the tank and the pipe housings as obstacles between us. When it came close, I was loud, swinging the axe into the vent pipes, into the metal housing of the water tank, into anything that would transmit noise into the building and out into the air. I was not trying to fight the creature. I was trying to be so persistently difficult, and so relentlessly present and so continuously loud that the situation could not resolve itself quietly. I was trying, in the plainest terms, to be impossible to deal with. I have some natural aptitude for this. The moon moved. I did not track it carefully, because tracking the moon carefully would have required me to stop paying attention to the creature, which was not an option. Time passed in the way time passes during sustained physical fear, in discrete moments with no reliable duration attached to them. Each moment complete in itself, the next moment not assumed until it arrives. At some point, I heard voices from below, from the street, carried up and distorted by the height and the cold. I recognized Ramos's voice first, then Figueroa's, then the professor's, distinctive even muffled by distance. With that particular quality of controlled urgency I'd heard him use with his men when equipment needed to be managed correctly. The creature heard it too. Animals hear things we don't, or hear them differently, and whatever the creature had become, retained enough of an animal's hearing to register the professor's voice as significant. Its attention shifted. The slow turn of the head toward the sound away from me. I moved to the far side of the water tank and put my back against it and slid down to a crouch and breathed. Below me from the street, the electrical hum of the device the professor had been building, low and sustained, with a pitch that hit somewhere in the jaw and the inner ear simultaneously. Figueroa saying something in a tight, controlled voice. The professor saying something back. The creature at the roof hatch, looking down. Some process happening in whatever remained of its cognition, caught between the moonlight that was pulling it one direction and the hum that was pushing it another. Then a shot. One shot from the street, the flat crack of a police pistol. Not one of the professor's men. I learned this afterward, from the officers themselves. They had been following the neighborhood after the first call, quietly, without entirely believing what they were following, but following it anyway. And they had arrived in time, and one of them had made the decision that needed to be made. The sounds from the creature changed. Not immediately. There was a moment of something very loud, and then a moment of nothing. And then the sound of something large and heavy on the fire escape, descending, and then from the street a series of sounds I chose not to try to interpret from the roof. Then quiet. I stayed behind the water tank for a considerable time after the quiet arrived. Long enough for the cold to be thoroughly inside my coat and my hands and the back of my neck. Long enough for the moon to have moved visibly. Long enough to be quite certain that the quality of the silence had returned to something normal, something with the ordinary weight of a city, in the middle of the night, rather than the changed weight I'd learned to recognize. I climbed back down through the hatch. The fourth-floor hallway was bright now, most of the doors open. Residents in various states of alarm in their doorways. I went down the stairs. The second floor. Doña Esperanza was in her doorway, watching me come down with the axe in my hand, and she looked at me, and then at the axe, and then back at me, and said nothing, which I respected. I walked out of the building into the street. The professor was there, with Ramos and Figueras, and 2 police officers. The thing that had been in the sarcophagus was in the street. It was not moving. It looked diminished in the way that very frightening things look diminished when they are no longer frightening. Smaller than it had seemed on the roof. the bandaging loose and settling. The quality that had been in it while the full moon was overhead, now gone. The street around it was entirely normal. The city was entirely normal. Someone from an upper floor of the building opposite had opened a window to look down, and was now closing it again. Paquita was at the edge of the small gathering that had accumulated, having come around from the back of the building when she heard the shot. She was wearing her coat over her house dress, and her hair was loose, and she looked at me coming out of the building's front door, with the axe still in my hand, and she took in the full picture of what I was presenting: the torn uniform, the gray face, the shaking hands, the axe, and she held my gaze for a long moment before she spoke. "Could have been killed," she said. "Probably," I said. "You are the most pig-headed, irresponsible," she said, and stopped, and crossed the distance between us and put her arms around me, which was the correct response to the situation and also the one I needed most. I held on to her with one hand and the axe with the other for a moment before I remembered to put the axe down. Professor was arrested, not immediately for the creature. The officers were still working through the vocabulary required to file a report that accurately described the creature. But for the other things, which emerged over the following days and weeks, as the laboratory was examined and catalogued, and the nature of his work was understood in its full scope: previous experiments, the failures, things that had been displayed in the museum's exhibition rooms wearing the faces and postures the professor had arranged for them, which I had walked past hundreds of times in the amber light and taken for wax. They were not all wax. I stopped going into the exhibition rooms of the closed museum after I learned this. Ramos and Figueras cooperated. They cooperated with the comprehensive thoroughness of men who have been waiting for someone to tell them they can stop. Figueras, particularly, had been holding something coiled for a long time, and when the investigators gave him the opportunity to put it down, he took it with both hands. The professor said very little. He maintained, through the initial interviews and beyond, that his work had been sound and the execution had simply encountered an unexpected variable. The unexpected variable being, apparently, the moon, whose effect on the specimen he had not adequately modeled. He had the look, by the time they took him away, of a man whose great project has ended in the wrong hands, and who cannot reconcile himself to the shape of the ending. He did not look at me during the time we were both in the street. I do not know if he thought about what he had taken from me without my knowledge. I suspect he filed it under the heading of necessary methodology and not revisited it. I was interviewed 4 times. 4 times I told the same story. The 4th time, the officer who had answered my original call, the one who had been patient and told me to remain outside, sat across a table from me in an interview room and looked at his notes, and then looked at me. "You went back into the museum," he said, after calling us, after being advised to stay outside. "Yes," I said. "Then you went to the building, alone." "Yes, with a fire axe. It was available." He looked at his notes again. "And then you went up the stairs." "Yes, to draw it up to the roof." "That wasn't exactly the plan," I said. "I didn't have exactly a plan." He looked at me for a long moment. He was a man in his 50s, heavy across the shoulders, with the permanent squint of someone who has seen a wide variety of human behavior and categorized most of it without surprise. He looked at me with an expression I could not fully read, and then he wrote something in his notes, and then he closed the notebook and thanked me for my time. There was a period afterward that I do not enjoy thinking about in detail. Medical attention, genuine and extended. A doctor who understood immediately that iron deficiency was a courtesy description for something considerably more systematic and more deliberate. Tests, treatments, the slow restoration of something that had been taken from me in small amounts over many months, which turned out to be more foundational than I had appreciated while losing it. Slept at reasonable hours for a long time. Kita managed this recovery with the firm efficiency she brings to everything she decides is important, and I was in no condition and had no desire to argue with any of it. She brought food from the cafe and sat with me in the evenings and did not make me feel diminished by needing it, which was its own kind of competence. I did not go back to the museum. It closed during the investigation, And when it reopened 6 months later, under new management, I had already taken a position at the Natural History Museum 2 districts over. A smaller building, better heated, with a chair in the night watchman's room that was actually designed for the purpose and no basement laboratory behind any of the locked doors. I checked. The professor's work was absorbed by a university committee that spent 2 years writing reports about it, and concluded, in the manner of committees, that it had been remarkable, and that no one should do it again. The specimens were handled according to procedures I was not told about and did not ask about. The museum's Egyptian corridor was entirely restocked with authenticated pieces from legitimate sources. The monsters room was redesigned. They kept the werewolf. I was told this by someone who went to the reopening. They'd righted it and relit it. And it looked, apparently, the same as it had always looked. Theatrical, slightly awkward at the knee, not quite frightening in the way the real thing is frightening, which is probably the correct relationship between the representation and the thing. The axe is in the utility room of the apartment Paquita and I share. Because she said throwing it away would be wasteful, and I said keeping it anywhere visible would be a constant reminder of an experience I was in no rush to revisit, and the utility room was the compromise. It leans in the corner next to the mop. I walk past it every morning on the way to the kitchen. Every morning I make the same coffee. I sit at the table by the window where the morning light comes in. My hands are mostly steady now. The gray at the edges of my vision is gone. I have regained what I lost, or most of it, or enough of it to constitute the working version of myself. I am not a hero. I was never a hero. I was a night watchman who was robbed slowly by a man who believed his project outweighed the small inconvenience of what he was taking, and who went up a staircase with a fire axe because the alternative was not going, and because Paquita's apartment was 3 floors above the landing where the creature was standing. That's the whole of it. The whole true accounting. Creature had centuries of wrong momentum behind it, and a lunar cycle that rewrote it every month, and a professor's obsession driving it forward. I had an axe from a supply closet and a stubbornness so old and so deep, I've never been able to locate its origin. In the end, it was enough to keep the situation alive until someone more equipped could end it. I consider that sufficient. I have learned over the years to find sufficiency sufficient. Some things you carry, some things you put in the utility room. The difference matters less than you'd think.